"Impossible," said the disciples as they look at the crowd of people who have followed Jesus. "Where are we to buy bread for all these people to eat?" Impossible is often our first response when confronted by a challenge. Impossible. Can't be done. Impossible. There's not enough. Impossible when we are challenged to try something new. Impossible when our imagination is limited by what we know and we are unable to imagine what is possible. But we know that all things are possible with God. And of course, as one theologian has observed, with Jesus, who redefines what is possible. So the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is much about the generosity of Jesus' compassion for hungry people as it is about the power of God to work miracles. God's power, after all, is far more than all we can ask or imagine, as Jim read in Ephesians. In August of 2014, leaders from our church gathered for a day away to imagine whether we could move forward with our building project. If you're not too shy, would you raise your hand? I know who was there. Yeah. Will? Robert, weren't you there? Yes. Phil, were you there? I think you were there. I have pictures to prove it. Okay. By August of 2014, we have seen the architectural plans. They were presented in March of that year. In May of 2014, we had a congregational vote to see how much money we could raise in a capital campaign by the fall. We had spent months in the world of impossible. We can't do this. It's too big. But that day when we gathered, we were blessed by the leadership of a consultant, George, who had a friend. And George, with a beautiful home on the shores of the Chesapeake, George so believed in our vision that he convinced his friends to let us hang out at their house that day and to use this beautiful little house that was at the end of this very long boat dock. As we met, we could hear the water softly hitting the pier, and we were surrounded by a sense of calm and peace in the midst of our fears. And we talked, led by George. We had the usual newsprint and markers. We made lists of our doubts and fears, our dreams and our hopes. We prayed together. We ate together. It was a good day. And we all felt pretty good about what was up on those sheets of newsprint. It was a very ER-UCC process. If we write it down, we can make a report and we'll have that stuff codified and we'll be able to decide what we're going to do. And we were feeling pretty good about the day until George looked at the group and said, "I don't think your greatest challenge is raising money. I think your greatest challenge is whether you trust God." And yes, that's what happened to us. There was a stunned silence in the room. And he really pushed us. Do you really trust God with your future? Do you really believe that God can work through each one of you and your congregation to be a witness for the love and justice of Jesus Christ in the world today? I think we came back changed from that event. It was a sobering question. And some of you may remember that the day after that retreat, the participants stood here in front of you and made a testimony of sorts. It was like being in the Baptist church or a Pentecostal church. We were testifying to how we believed that God was at work within us. It was something different for us to talk about our faith in that way. And we were challenged by George and each other to imagine a different kind of future. Over these years, there have been more than a few times when we have been overwhelmed by the needs in front of us, and we've been afraid, and we've turned to the information. We've turned to facts at hand to assess the situation. We've run more spreadsheet reports than you can possibly imagine to figure out solutions, and we sometimes felt powerless in what seemed to be a lack of resources. It was too much to handle. We didn't have enough. We didn't have enough people. We didn't have enough energy. We didn't have enough money, and so we kept saying it can't be done and it's going to be impossible. It felt like the disciples who felt so powerless that day in the face of so many hungry people. We felt powerless at times with what seemed to be never-ending obstacles. And how do you move forward in the midst of those kind of hard, cold facts? But then we remembered that we had God with us on the journey. And we had to remind ourselves not to look at what we didn't have, but to look at what we did have. What was in our midst. And so we were able to multiply with your help, with hands and hearts who painted and did all manner of kinds of work around the buildings. For those of you who were unafraid to go and ask your friends and fellow congregants to say, can you give this money towards this project, towards our vision? See, scarcity and fear and overwhelming needs will drain us. They will drain us if we don't turn to a power that's greater than us. Do we believe that God is working in us to do far more than we can ask or imagine? Maybe we've actually asked for too little in these years, because God can do far more than we can imagine. Maybe our vision has been limited by what we think we can do rather than what God thinks we can do. The most familiar explanation of the feeding of the 5,000 is to go to this act of generosity, because we love the image of this little boy sharing his lunch, handing over his 2 fish and the 5 loaves of bread to Jesus, who blesses the food and breaks the bread and feeds 5,000 people. And we love this image that there were leftovers. That's generosity. That's abundance. But it's also about the power of God at work, about God's amazing power to completely transform human expectations. I do believe something changed after that retreat in August of 2014. And those of you who have come into our congregation since then have experienced a different congregation. We have always honored our history. We have always been good stewards of our resources. We have always been well aware of what we have and what we need. But this building project, with all its challenges, caused us to trust God and one another in ways that we never imagined 4 years ago. And for those of you who have come into our community in the past few years, I want to thank you, because as you've heard us say, we were not sure anybody new would want to come into our midst in the midst of chaos, in the midst of the mess, in the midst of rock and mud and raising significant money. But you brought energy. You brought hope. You came and said, we believe in this future of this congregation and all of you. And I am so grateful for your presence, because you came at a time when many of us were tired and we were aching and we were unsure. And you brought faith. You brought a gift of love and grace to each one of us. And so today, I give thanks for everyone that's gone before us, because everybody has contributed something, like the village people in the story of the stone soup. Every contribution has made a difference to where we are today. For I give thanks for the many ways in which we have transformed worry into faith as a congregation, and fear into hope, and uncertainty into trust. Where we once saw scarcity, now we see abundance. So with God, we are reminded that the impossible becomes possible. With faith, we can do far more than we can ever imagine. And this is good news. Thanks be to God. Amen.